Hello and welcome to our ACE 27 conference presentation. The title of our presentation is No Child Dragged Along, Examining the Psychology of Low-Tracked Students and Investigating Ways to Unlock the Efficacy of Their Education. So with that, let's get started by talking a little bit about our goal. So the overall goal of our research and our discussion here is really for us as teachers to increase student learning efficacy amidst existing educational opportunities. So that means taking what is currently in place in terms of our teaching practices and institutions that we have in our schools and increasing how students feel about the way that they're learning and the effort that they put into their education every day. So getting started with that, let's talk a little bit about tracking because that's a big piece of this conversation. So as the technical definition, tracking is the curricular differentiation in student placement practices in K through 12 systems. So when you think about things like math pipelines in middle school and high school, or classes such as prep, regular, honors, AP, dual enrollment, it's when we systematically place students into those classrooms and into those specific tracks that is termed as tracking. And so the theory behind this is that tracking is designed in order to enhance teaching and learning by targeting instruction and course content to student ability and prior knowledge. So students who have historically achieved higher test scores being placed into honors and AP and dual enrollment courses because they're at a higher level than their counterparts.
So Alyssa just described what tracking is. Let's take a look at how tracking started in America. The original schools in America looked like a one-room schoolhouse, and there were varying ages, an age range in this schoolhouse. The curriculum consisted of books and materials students had at home, and less than 8% of adolescents attended high school until the 1890s. So formal education ended in the 8th grade. This can also be kind of described as a pyramid here, where we can see that most children attended school at the elementary level. And then as you get into higher levels, you can see that less and less students attend more kind of formal education into high school. This is because up until the 20th century, American economy was just agricultural. So students didn't really need a formal education. Adolescents worked for their families and supported their families and didn't need formal education to kind of provide for themselves and also for their families. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the American economy shifted from agriculture to industry. So students now needed more than an 8th grade education. And because of this, they shifted into a tracking system where they created tracks for vocation and also for academics. So students who wanted to enter right into the workforce after high school would participate in the vocational track, and then students who wanted to maybe attend higher education after high school would enter into the academic track. Now, some implications that came from tracking, some kind of unintended consequences, was when schools desegregated in 1954. This was intended to expand educational opportunities for people of color, but in reality, it actually created a way for segregation to exist in desegregated schools. So tracking was used as a way to separate recent European and other immigrants, Blacks and Hispanics from white American-born citizens. And we know from studies that track placements are strongly correlated with students' race, ethnicity, and social class. And within desegregated schools, tracking often resegregates school students by these attributes. So before we get into kind of the implications of tracking, this image here kind of shows us the different factors that factor into how students kind of get put into a track placement. So this starts with prior effort, their prior achievement, and background factors such as their socioeconomic status, neighborhood, and race.
So Caroline just told us a little bit about the history of tracking and what it's typically been used for. So let's talk a little bit about the problem that we're tackling today. So the issue here is that despite tracking, despite its intentions, kids are still underperforming. And so what exactly is underperforming? Well, students that are placed in higher tracks, we see that they're typically putting in more effort than students in lower tracks. So even though students are placed according to their ability and at their different educational levels, at their different ability levels, we would hope they all excel equally, but that's not what's happening. They're not putting in the effort to reach their maximum potential there, and they're kind of staying pretty stagnant throughout that process. And so, why is this idea of effort a problem? Obviously, we want students to succeed in their present track. We want them to succeed and excel and have the ability to potentially move on to a higher level track than they were previously placed. And at the baseline, students should have enough efficacy in their own academic abilities. They should have confidence in what they're able to do in the classroom, and so they should be able to put in the same effort in their track as those in tracks that are either higher or lower than their own and see the same learning results. So if you're putting in the effort, you're putting in the time and the energy to learn and do it well, then we should be able to see those same learning outcomes across the different tracking levels. And that's not necessarily what we're seeing right now.
Okay, so coming out of the problems of tracking that Alyssa just talked about and Caroline outlined through the history of tracking, we're going to now dive into the benefits, drawbacks, and then further implications of what tracking has for our students. So as we mentioned earlier, the only real benefit we saw with all of tracking was just that students placed in higher tracks exert more effort. The main problem with this, though, that we observed throughout our research was that this is completely conditional on whatever track the student gets placed into. So if the student gets placed into a higher track, they exert more effort, results in more learning, they're good to go. However, this kind of leads into our drawbacks for tracking. So that also means that, if a student gets placed in a lower track, that's going to directly affect how much effort they exert. And that's based on a lot of different things. So we'll now go into our drawbacks and kind of see what they entail for our implications and possible solutions going forward. So the first drawback we have is that lower tracking corresponds to lower effort. That's what I just outlined through the benefit that we saw. So students in a gradient based on whatever track they are in show a proportional amount of effort. And that's for a number of different reasons. The first reason we saw was that lower tracking probably corresponds to lower opportunities to learn. So this isn't something that was statistically represented by the data that we saw in our research, but it's plausible to assume that if a student is placed in a lower track, they might have less opportunities to learn than someone would in a higher track. So higher tracks usually move at a faster pace. They sometimes have more advanced teachers than lower tracks do. So in that way, students might be able to exert more effort just by being placed in a higher track, given that there are a lot of situational varieties of what they might be doing in that higher track classroom. Another drawback was that lower tracking tends to exacerbate pre-existing racial and SES inequalities. We saw that mainly not in what students did when they got into a track, but it existed before they got into the track. So students who maybe had an underprivileged childhood or who went to a school that did not let them achieve their full potential, through no fault of their own, were placed in a lower track. And because they were placed in a lower track, they did not have the tools that they needed to achieve what they could. They were not challenged. They were not believed in by their teachers, maybe. And this just kind of perpetuated what existed before they even got into that track in the first place. So this was something that happened prior to the student entering the tracking system in the first place. And then the last big drawback we saw was that once a student entered into a track, especially a lower track, there was an extreme issue with any sort of upward mobility. So once a student was placed into a lower track, it was difficult for them to move up and kind of gain the skills they needed to trade up to the next track, which would allow them to exert more effort, as the data showed, and then from there increase their learning. So those are our drawbacks. Our implications from this were a little varied. One thing we saw was that a student's track placement would definitely include something of a teacher perception bias. So a student in a higher track might have a different identity or a different self-image based on a teacher perception than a student in a lower track would. So teachers in higher tracks might automatically assume that their students are more higher achieving, more likely to turn in homework, more likely to do well on tests, things like that. And they might be encouraged by that, whereas students in lower tracks might be sort of let down by the fact that they're in a lower track. And their teachers might have a consequent opinion of their students based on their placement. And this obviously affects the self-image of whoever might be in the lower track. High tracks might also be associated with intellectual effort. So some of the research we looked at observed different kinds of effort that students put out. So we looked at intellectual effort, which was just raw learning potential. We looked at procedural effort, which was the ability to turn in homework. And then we also looked at rule following effort too, which was just general rule following during class. So high tracks might be associated with purely intellectual effort, which is kind of the highest effort we saw of the three. And then lower tracks might be associated with the other two kinds, which is just a teacher hoping that their student turns in homework or hoping that they follow the rules during class without ever being concerned about them learning during class, which is obviously a big problem. And then finally, we saw that at the same levels of effort, students who were placed in higher tracks showed more learning than students who were placed in lower tracks did. And this kind of hits on all the drawbacks we saw already, but absolutely goes into the gaps between racial, SES gaps, and then just the placement that students have going forward into their tracking experience.
So we've discussed why tracking exists, some of the unintended consequences of tracking, the benefits and also drawbacks of tracking. And now we would like to discuss an alternative to tracking, which would be an inclusive instruction classroom. One way that we can have an inclusive instruction classroom is through the use of individual zones of proximal development. So a zone of proximal development is the potential for learning with help. We can see here to the right with our image here, our target in the center, in that dark blue shaded area. This is what the learner can do independently, what they can do on their own. And then in the middle, we can see that zone of proximal development. That's what learners can do with the help of others. And then that outer circle is what learners can't do even with guidance. It's kind of too far out of their limit, their learning potential at their age. This is a social type of learning with interactions with one another. And this is a way that teachers and students can use the different abilities of student levels as resources in the inclusive classroom. So I'd like to show you guys what that actually looks like. So we can see here in this image, these arrows here, these are individual zones of proximal development that learners may have in the classroom. So this would be different abilities all in the same classroom. And what the teacher can do is craft this learning environment where these zones of proximal development are overlapping and interacting with one another so that the overall zone of proximal development for the learning community is greater than the individual learning zones of proximal development. So we can see here at the bottom, this larger arrow here encompasses all of the individual zones of proximal development for the individual learners. Ways that teachers can do this in the classroom is to create a norm that learning is social and everyone has to contribute to the shared learning experience. Learners must listen to one another. They must give feedback, ask questions, and also build their ideas off of one another. So this idea of a shared learning experience. This will also create a sense of belonging in the classroom. And also teachers must have high expectations for all students. So all students are expected to reach the learning outcome or the learning goal. And they do that through working with one another.
So let's say you're a first or second year teacher and you're wondering, with or without tracks, how can I help my underperforming students? Now, some of the research that we looked at specifically is, as first and second year teachers, we can't do these systematic overhauls in our schools, in our classrooms. We're often confined to the systems we get, whether it's tracked or untracked. And we work with the students we get, high performing, low performing. But we know as teachers that we can build student learning wherever they are, at the lowest end or at the highest end. We believe that each student could do better and live up to their potential. So our research led us to look at student effort as a main factor in student achievement. As Matthew talked about earlier on, student effort was higher in those high track courses. Now, what if overall we could improve student effort? We know that education is a two-way street, that as teachers, we present a material, we do our best to do so in an inclusive, in an active way. But ultimately, what it comes down to is students need to learn. To use an analogy, if a classroom is not bright enough with learning, we can improve our instruction. We can turn up the lights. We can do more interesting activities for students to watch and engage with. But ultimately, some students could choose to sit there with their eyes closed. Now, that's an extreme example, but it shows that student effort or engagement matters, and that in order to achieve, these students need to be actively engaged. So we researched what's called psychological interventions in order to improve student effort. Now, these are very, very small scale interventions that sometimes just take a matter of minutes. Oftentimes they're learning based, as in you'll teach a certain lesson on, say, growth mindset, or they're written activities where a student actively writes out their goals or affirms their own values that they hold and that they practice. Now, these aim to increase the quality of the education that is already happening in the classroom. As one researcher put it, if you have a plane that has engines and all the things ready to take off, these psychological interventions are the small things like tilt on the wings that is going to allow the airflow to bring that plane right off the ground. So they're small solutions, but hopefully with a big impact. Now, the goal of all three of these types, whether it be goal setting, whether it be value affirmations, or teaching a growth mindset, is to either explicitly or implicitly introduce students to the metacognitive practices that lead to a growth mindset. In other words, we want them to open their eyes, to begin to take advantage of those opportunities that are already present within the classroom. And we do this through a quick intervention. 15 minutes to an hour could mean a year's worth of difference. How, you might ask? Well, once a student starts to succeed and starts to learn, this builds what's called a reinforcing virtuous cycle. Students who do well on one test are more likely to study harder for the next test. So over the course of the year, these psychological interventions have shown to improve student achievement. Now, as a first and second year teacher focused on lesson planning, we don't want to overwhelm you, but there are small ways where you could implement these highly researched, empirically grounded psychological interventions in your own classroom. Here are the steps. First, you need to choose your type of intervention. This could be teaching about growth mindset. This could be having your students write out their values that they affirm. Or it could be having your students write about their own personal or academic goals, both of which, importantly, have shown to improve student achievement over time. Next, researchers say, you need to craft your implementation for your specific context. As the classroom teacher, you know best what your classroom context is. And here are the two factors you need to take into account: the age of your students and also their cultural context. Many of these psychological implementations have been tested on MBA students getting their graduate degrees. Now, you can take those same ideas, but if you're teaching second grade, you need to boil those interventions down into a second grade format. In the same way, if the studies of these psychological interventions have been practiced in Europe and you teach in the Southwest of the United States, you need to change up some of the language to fit your context. This has been shown in crafting your intervention to make it way more successful. Finally, we'd like to thank you for joining us, for learning about psychological interventions in the context of helping underperforming students in the classroom. We hope that this presentation has piqued your interest and that you will further explore this topic by joining our discussion that we'll be having, and also getting involved in trying to make your own psychological intervention fit in your own classroom to improve your students' learning outcomes.